There are a lot of videos online about why we're so tired, and basically all of these cover the pillars: sleep, diet, sunlight, exercise, and of course all of these help, but to me none of these videos are addressing the core issue, because I think there's been a change within our culture, and through this we've lost touch with what Byung calls the sacred dimension of rest, and when this is forgotten, no amount of purely physical remedies will do the trick. It's as though within our culture there is a muted screaming, and we take that strain in our vocal cords and call it tiredness. I think there's a more helpful answer available to us, one that's remarkably simple as well. In essence, our ideas about how we think about rest and how we think about self-care have become too production-focused, too narrow-minded, and too self-centered. And because of these changes, these movements towards a sort of narcissism, we have lost touch with this sacred dimension of rest. And when the significance of rest is lost, it becomes a mere derivative form of work. But thankfully, there are plenty of ways back to sacred rest. I think our intuitions are actually tuned for it, as long as we're willing to dwell in silence and allow ourselves to dissolve. And without this understanding, I don't think there's going to be any solution to the exhaustion, because no amount of production can fill our need for emptiness. This video is based heavily on Byung-Chul On the Disappearance of Rituals. Unfortunately, I left my copy in America, which makes finding the direct quotes hard, but know that practically every idea in this video has its heritage with Han. So what is the sacred dimension of rest? It's spaces wherein your self is surrendered. It's when your sense of separation from the world lulls, and you have the feeling of being a part of a grander picture. Think here of being faced with the grandeur of nature, when you're suddenly made aware of how small you are before the mountains and the stars. We used to imbibe this sentiment into our rituals with immense spiritual seriousness. For example, if we look to the biblical story of creation, we are presented with a creation myth wherein God rested on the seventh day. It's easy to miss the significance of this, but we're talking about an almighty being here. Nonetheless, he rested, and it implies that the rest was an essential part of the creation itself. The rest wasn't just a form of recovery from the work. Without that rest, the creation wouldn't have been complete. Rest is interwoven into the act of creation itself. We've carried the profundity of this truth into rituals like the Sabbath, a day of rest and worship. And this is echoed across cultures as well, for example in the Buddhist Uposatha. These rituals serve to highlight ways of being in which the individual loses all of their importance amidst the vastness. Today, however, the individual is never asked to disappear. Instead, we are taught to assert ourselves, to come forward ever more forthrightly and powerfully. And this so-called sacred dimension of rest isn't about any particular religion. It's a way of understanding the world and your place within it. It's something that humans have known for all of their history. John Vervaeke, a psychologist and philosopher, might call it participatory knowing. This describes the understanding and changes in behavior that take place when you feel like you fit in, when you feel a part of a scene which makes sense, a broader picture. And because it is a form of being, this approach has its hands in the ways in which we socialize, in the ways in which we work. It's a very broad-facing perspective. This way of being is deeply restorative in ways that cannot be touched by the currents of our culture that are always looking to consume more things and to consume more emotions. To understand this, let's analyze the special role that silence plays in rituals like the Sabbath. Silence is the great equalizer. When people gather in silence, they are wordlessly affirming what matters most to them, without any mind paid to status or position, without any performance of self. They are engaging in what Han calls community without communication. In silence, the boundaries between individuals blur, and the ego, with all of its chatter, quiets. This is what has been lost, what cannot be touched by a culture of constant consumption. because silence requires the belief in something higher than human experience, something that can only be accessed through silence, something of which nothing can be said but is nonetheless understood. Silence is distance from the self. Contrast this now with so many of the modern forms of rest, like rotting in bed, or flexing, or binge watching videos, or many of the other ways which people talk about self-care. These do not create a distance from the self, rather they feed it. There will never be a serene sense of unison with that damn phone. The way these technologies are set up are inherently restless. The phone, the screen, the laptop, it's always changing. It's never finished. Whereas the ethic of silence is different. Silence is about lingering around a finished form. That you have something to be silent for implies that there's a completion already finished. Think of how rituals that are used to promote sacred rest, like within the liturgy or the Japanese tea ceremony, that have these strict forms. In these places, you're not looking to assert yourself or add anything to it. You're a performer. You're participating in what already is. And again, this really isn't about drawing your mind to religious ceremonies, but rather about ways of being in which there is a distance from the self, in which you are not the primary object of fascination. Because when all of your ways of resting are all about you, you are creating a disconnection from the world rather than a connection. You are reifying the sense of being an individual that is separate from the scene, when perhaps what would bring you true rest, deep resonance, is a sense of communion with the space in which you are. Today, people increasingly live as though they are merely human, like there's nothing beyond this individual singular experience that they have, nothing worth surrendering the self and being silent for, because what is there left for rest to do if this divine dimension does not exist? It becomes just a way to recover from work, or a way to further indulge the ego, which too feels like a form of work, an endless self-documentation, or a distraction, a constant entertainment of the ego. Leisure becomes labor, a constant performance, with people always finding out ways to rest up for the upcoming day of work, or otherwise thinking of how their downtime will be perceived by others because this is the only dimension that makes sense to them, these merely human affairs, or otherwise just entertaining themselves to death. I'd even say that activities like binge watching are attempts to get at what's achieved in sacred forms of rest, ways of creating distance from the self, of quieting the mind and the ego. Unfortunately, these mediums simply do not create the same sense of connection that these sacred forms of rest do, because all of them reify separation from the outside world. Their interest is principally with the individual and their interiority. But true rest can be found in surrender. Why is it that a sense of relief is produced when you're reminded that you're made of stardust, that the atoms that comprise you came from stars that exploded? Or when you're reminded that in some way or another you are directly connected to the very first humans that have reached across thousands and thousands of years of cultures, humans who've suffered torments and joys and everything in between. It's because perspectives like this shrink the importance of the self, they quiet the ego, and if only for a moment, you come to understand that even without the assertion of the self, the assertion of you and your importance, you can still exist. So sacred rest is surrender, not to entertainment but to emptiness, and not to self-improvement but to self-dissolution. Which leads me to my great gripe with how rest is spoken of nowadays. It's almost always using the language of self-help, which to me is exactly the opposite of what's going to produce a true sense of restorative rest. To explain, it'll be useful to consider our cultural movement towards capitalism as a philosophy, which tends us towards a kind of narcissism. Please note that I'm speaking here not about capitalism as an economic system, but rather as a philosophy. The market structures of the world need not define our minds and how we relate to the world, but it can and often does, and in the case of rest, I can certainly see its impact. Capitalism dissolves the boundaries between the sacred and the profane by making all things comparable to one another. It makes everything legible through the lenses of production and of capital. Because of this, it becomes easy to start conceptualizing your life through the explicit dollar value that every action has. And this can be troublesome because capital never rests. Its incentive is always to produce more and more. Money is always moving. It has no space for dwelling, for long periods of gathering in silence. It's easy to inherit from the system the feeling that your life is something to fix, something that always requires work, something which can be ever optimized and catalogued. Which is why it's said that when rest has no sacred dimension, it becomes a mere derivative form of work. I think we can see this even in the ways people talk nowadays about the need for rest. People pitch taking breaks that you can be more effective when you come back to work. Or even think about how people refer to longer rest periods like sabbaticals or even spiritual quests. People talk about trying to find their life's purpose or know their mission. It's the language of production all the way down. And the attitudes of production is antithetical to the dwelling that occurs when you stay with silence or when you're basking in the flow of the world. When you're taking part in being in these ways, you're not producing anything. You're doing the opposite. You are emptying yourself. And this cannot be done with expectation of outcome. To do so spoils the effort. Dwelling with silence implies that there's some greater unity that already exists, something that needs no fixing. Something that cannot be produced, but can only be participated in. This is the fundamental tension, where dwelling with silence is all about lingering around forms which are already complete. Capitalism and mindsets which emphasize constant production are all about endlessness, constancy. And I'd really advocate a middle way here, not chastising one or the other, but we ought not to view everything through this lens of production, because when rest gets completely understood through this lens, it becomes just another way to work on ourselves, just another way to produce value. We are losing the language to understand rest in any other framework, and it's vitally important that we don't. And this stance has a radical quality to it that I think is easy to miss on first pass. It's worth reiterating that rituals that emphasize emptiness and silence involve lingering around forms which are already complete. It develops sensitivity to the preeminent perfection, an idea that an ever-productive mind rejects implicitly, for production always implies a need for something to be fixed and changed. Additionally, sacred rest opposes narcissism because it states outright that this isn't about you. Think here of religious rituals with strict forms. They do not emphasize being authentic or anything like that. They are about self-forgetting. And here's where I find one of the most compelling points to me about the importance of sacred rest. That in our modern culture, I believe there's something very tiresome about the incessant focus on authenticity and personal expressions and these assertions of self. To my mind, these actions contain within them a slight sense of disconnection, for an assertion of yourself, an assertion of your own importance, is necessarily distinguishing yourself from the world in which you participate. To me, there's just something exhausting about it, and also a bit too precious, like, who cares? Divine rest teaches us to widen the aperture, to let go of this self-importance, to be a part of the broader scene. Through emptiness and silence, you can disappear into a world. And I think that the expression of the human being as a collective is closer to truth than the one of the human being as an individual. Of course, both have their merits, but no man is an island. I'd stress too that this isn't an argument against capitalism. Rather, it's about putting things in their proper place and not allowing an economic system to determine your entire way of conceptualizing yourself and the world. If you've enjoyed this and like these kinds of topics, I want to let you know that I'm starting a Substack soon. I've left the link in the description. In many ways, writing is a more natural medium for me, and there's a lot of exciting things I'd love to do in that format. Anyway, let's return to the idea of sacred rest. Thankfully, there is a lot that can be done here. Ways of resting in this sacred way are entirely natural to us. Essentially, to reconnect in this way, all you have to do is tune yourself constantly to forms of being where you exist as a scene rather than a singular. Spend more time with silence and appreciation of those things of which nothing can be said, but whose meaning still rings through with profundity. Be dwarfed. Go out into nature. Experience viscerally what it means to be a thread in the world's tapestry. What's mystical here too is that the stance towards sacred rest is an outlook. It's a way of seeing that frees. And so you can incorporate this into the ways that you speak with your friends or the way that you read books. Experience them with this wider aperture. Know them as this great cosmic question mark. Participate in being with them without the need for self-assertion and for separation. You can spend time in silence, in meditation, in ritual acts of giving, or just doing nothing. And you can find ways to incorporate these attitudes of non-productiveness to other aspects of your life, to do things without any expectation of outcome, like a child. To quote Bertrand Russell, "The antidote, insofar as it is a matter of individual psychology, is to be found in history, biology, astronomy, and all those studies which, without destroying self-respect, enable the individual to see himself in his proper perspective, some understanding of the strangely accidental and ephemeral position of man in the cosmos. It is from the large perceptions, combined with impersonal emotion, that wisdom most readily springs." The awareness alone goes so far, for by lingering in these things which are already complete, we can find out how much of life is already livid in this completeness. Part of why I don't stress very specific techniques or tactics to do here is because this is an attitude that utterly de-emphasizes techniques and tactics. It's trying to bring you in touch with something far more important. To me, there's such grace and freedom in this perspective. It's merely the shift from self to world. I'd go as far as to say that the highest expressions of this understanding can be seen in saintly figures like Saint Francis, the Buddha, or Vimalakirti, all of whom talk about being at home in the world. This sentiment reflects the sense of unity that they've cultivated at an incredibly deep level. It's through this that rest becomes not about recovery, but about reverence, not about disconnection, but about connection.